Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, for today's deck tech, I decided to try something just a little different. Now, I've been building budget decks for quite a long time at this point, but for today's episode, I decided to challenge myself and make it so that every single card in the deck has to be less than $1. Or I guess I should say that every single card in the 99 has to be less than $1. I just thought it was a fun and interesting restriction, and yeah, I really like the way that this deck turned out. With that said, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this idea as well, so whether you like it or don't like it, please let me know in the comments below. Anyways, today's episode comes to you courtesy of my amazing patrons. Once a month, patrons of this channel vote on what commander that they'd like to see in an upcoming episode. The commander that gets the most votes wins. And the commander that they selected for this month was Volo Guide to Monsters. Volo is a 3/2 human wizard that costs 2 green-blue. It has, whenever you cast a creature spell that doesn't share a creature type with a creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, copy that spell. And a copy of a spell becomes a token. So essentially, Volo is kind of an anti-tribal matters commander. The less overlap that you have with your creature types, the better. Because essentially doubling up all of your creature spells is an incredibly impactful and powerful thing. So you're going to want to make sure that you don't have a ton of overlap when it comes to creature types because, yeah, you're not getting all the value that you could be getting if you've got another creature that shares that same type in play or in your graveyard already. And there are some really cool and interesting things that we can do with this commander as well, yes, even on a budget. So we'll get to some more of the interesting things here in a bit, but yeah, let's break this commander down into some tactics. First up, let's talk about some of the ways that we're going to ramp in this deck with cards like Ornithopter Paradise, Silvermere, and Coppermere. Each of these are simple mana dorks that cost 2 and tap for 1. Ornithopter Paradise taps for 1 mana of any color, Silvermere taps for blue, and Coppermere taps for green. Regardless, with creature types of Thopter and Mere, those aren't all that common of creature types. So because of that, and with the low number of these that we're running in the deck, yeah, we're going to have a pretty high percentage chance of doubling up on these spells. Next up, we've got some other 2 mana creatures that can help us ramp, or at least temporarily ramp, with Elysian Caryatid and Nest Invader. Elysian Caryatid has tap, add 1 mana of any color. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, add 2 mana of any one color instead. Unfortunately, Volo is just underneath that 4 mark, but we've got plenty of creatures in this deck that we'll get to here in a bit that can help us get to 4. And then Nest Invader is a 2/2 Eldrazi drone, and when it enters the battlefield, we get a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn that we can sacrifice for mana. So while this isn't permanent ramp, it is great temporary ramp, and actually it can kind of be a mana boost when we actually cast this spell and double up with Volo. Again, when we copy this, we're getting its ETB twice, so we get 2 of those little Eldrazi spawn that we can sacrifice for mana, so it kind of in a way pays for itself. And yeah, 4 bodies for 2 mana is never a bad thing. We've also got some more permanent and more protected sources of ramp though, with things like Wood Elves, Yavimaya Dryad, and Springbloom Druid. Wood Elves is going to get us a forest into play untapped, Yavimaya Dryad gets us 1 into play tapped, and Springbloom Druid has us sacrifice 1 land to go get 2 basic lands into play tapped. Now while Dryad isn't a very popular creature type, Elf unfortunately very much is. So I definitely had to pick and choose the right elves to include in this deck, and Wood Elves and Springbloom Druid seem like great picks. Again, with our commander, we can really take advantage of ETBs because, again, if we get a copy of the creature that we cast, we get that ETB twice. See how with each of these for just 3 mana, we essentially ramp by 2 lands, which is incredible. And yeah, with Wood Elves again, those lands come into play untapped, so it almost pays for itself right away. Next up, we've got some other ways to ramp with our Boreal Grazer and Risen Reef. Our Boreal Grazer is a simple 0/3 beast with reach, and when it comes into play, we can put a land from our hand onto the battlefield tapped. Now, although there are some other beasts in this deck, most of them actually don't matter what their creature type is, and we'll get to that here in a bit. But yeah, beast isn't all that popular of a creature type for this deck. Getting this down early obviously can help us get our commander down really quickly, but yeah, if our commander is already in play, doubling this up and getting 2 lands from our hand into play is huge. Obviously, we've got plenty of ways to fill our hand with cards, and we'll get to those here in a bit, but yeah, just being able to dump some lands into play for just 1 mana, that's incredible. And speaking of dumping lands into play in card advantage, there's Risen Reef. It's a 1/1 elemental, and whenever it or another elemental enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. If you don't put the card onto the battlefield, put it in your hand. Basically, if the top is a land, congratulations, you've ramped. If not, congratulations, it's in your hand. Either way, you win. And yeah, when we cast this and copy it with our commander, we're getting that trigger 3 times. Obviously, this and the copy each have their own trigger, and one sees the other one come into play as well. And then obviously, if we have any other elementals come into play, we're going to get that trigger twice as long as this and the copy are on the field. So yeah, this can be a very impactful card for us. Speaking of which, a really impactful mechanic with this commander is Mutate with things like Migratory Greathorn, Auspicious Sterix, and Souvenir Snatcher. Let's just go through an example with the Migratory Greathorn. It is a 3/4 beast, but its creature type actually doesn't really matter because it's got Mutate for 2 and a green. Mutating means that if you cast it for its Mutate cost, you put it over or under target non-human creature you own. They mutate into the creature on top plus all the abilities from under it. And Migratory Greathorn specifically says, when this creature mutates, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. So basically, here's what you do. You mutate this onto a creature other than your commander, obviously, since your commander is a human. Again, just by putting it under that other creature, the creature is going to keep its creature type and whatnot, and you're just basically adding on that additional ability. You're also getting the copy of this creature with your commander, so you do the exact same thing with a copy. Overall, you're going to be getting 3 mutate triggers. You get the initial one, you get the copy, and you get the one that's seen because you're basically mutating onto a creature that has that mutate clause. So yeah, overall, by mutating this for 2 and a green onto a creature and getting the copy, you are getting 3 lands into play tapped. And then if you keep mutating onto that creature with other things, well, things get really out of control. For example, Auspicious Sterix says, whenever this creature mutates, exile cards in the top of your library to exile X permanents, where X is the number of times this creature is mutated, put those permanents onto the battlefield. Again, even just with this, getting that 3 mutates, that's gonna be huge. Or how about Souvenir Snatcher, which says, when this creature mutates, gain control of target non-creature artifact. Now, obviously I could have included this in another section, but I included it in ramp because a good target can be people's, mana rocks. So although this does have a pretty high mutate cost, you can kind of get some of your mana back, or even all of your mana back if you're lucky enough to hit some really big mana rocks. But now that we've gone through the ramp cards, let's move on to some cards that can help us with some card advantage. First up, let's talk about some very simple creatures with some very simple ETBs with Fibbleflip, Wall Blossoms, and Skyscanner. I guess Fibbleflip's ETB isn't really all that simple, but for this deck's purposes, it is because we're just going to be casting it, entering the battlefield, and drawing a card. Or I guess drawing 2 cards because we're going to get a copy of it and it's going to die, but we still get 2 cards out of it. So yeah, Wall Blossoms is kind of the exact same thing, though it's not legendary, so we will get to keep both copies. It's a 0/4 plant wall defender, and when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. And then Skyscanner is a Thopter, a 1/1 flyer for 3 that says when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So again, getting some extra bodies on the field and getting to draw some cards for not a lot of mana, that can be pretty fantastic. Speaking of which, let's talk about another great mutate creature in this deck with Dreamtail Heron. It's a 3/4 flying elemental bird that says whenever this creature mutates, draw a card. And again, just by mutating with this and getting a copy of it, essentially we get that 3 times, so yeah, 3 cards for just 1 creature, that's pretty fantastic. But another great card in this deck is going to be Mulldrifter. It's a 2/2 elemental with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, we draw 2 cards, and we can actually evoke it for 2 and a blue. Now, by evoking it, we can cast it for its evoke cost, but when we do, it's sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. That being said, the copy that we make when we cast this with its evoke cost doesn't get sacrificed. So for just 3 mana, we're going to be drawing 4 cards and getting to keep 1 2/2 flyer in play. That's a really good deal. Some other great deals come with cards like Garruk's Pack Leader, Karuga the Macro Sage, and Sphinx of Athun. Garruk's Pack Leader is a 4/4 beast that says whenever another creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So obviously when we get our copy of this, we're getting that trigger once, but then whenever we get any creature coming in play with power 3 or greater, we're going to be drawing 2 cards. But then Karuga the Macro Sage is one that can help us out a lot right away with a huge burst of card draw. It's a 5/4 dinosaur hippo, and yeah, those are not very common creature types, especially in this deck, but yeah, when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card for each other permanent we control with converted mana cost 3 or greater. Now, the copy that we get is going to die, but again, it's still going to be doing its job by getting us that big ETB. And speaking of a big ETB, Sphinx of Athun is a 5/6 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, we reveal the top 5 cards of our library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. We put 1 pile into our hand, the other into our graveyard. So it's essentially a Factor Fiction, but yeah, on a giant body that we get 2 of. We've also got some ways to recur cards though with things like Skullwinder and Paleoloth. Skullwinder is a 1/3 snake with Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, we return target card from our graveyard to our hand, then we choose an opponent. That player returns a card from their graveyard to their hand. So this can actually be a political tool for us as well, where we can just, pick the opponent that's going to give us the best deal. And again, since we get a copy of this, that's going to be 2 cards, so we can wheel and deal and pick 2 opponents, or just pick 1 and benefit them heavily. And then Paleoloth is a 5/5 beast that says whenever the creature with power 5 or greater comes into play under your control, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. The vast majority of cards in this deck are creature cards, and when we have those 5/5s come in, we can get a lot of cool things back. So once we're set up properly, this can be a really big and impactful effect for us. Again, by having 2 of these copies in play, now whenever we get another creature with power 5 or greater coming into play, and the copy of that creature as well, we're going to get 4 things back from our graveyard. So yeah, that's a pretty huge effect. And speaking of cards with huge effects, let's talk about some cards like Diluvian Primordial, Verdant Sun's Avatar, and Moldgraph Monstrosity. Diluvian Primordial is a 5/5 avatar flying with an incredible ETB. When it enters the battlefield for each opponent, you may cast up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. And if a spell cast this way we put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Basically, this comes into play and we get to cast 3 things for free. And then again with the copy of it, we're getting 3 more things. So yeah, for 7 mana, we can cast basically 6 spells and we get 2 5/5 flyers. That's a really good deal. It can definitely be a game-changing or game-ending kind of card. But another 7 mana card that can help us out in a very different way is Verdant Sun's Avatar. It's a 5/5 dinosaur avatar that says whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. So even just by casting this and getting a copy of it with our commander, we're going to be gaining 15 life and getting 2 5/5s. And then when any creature comes into play under our control, we gain 2 times that creature's toughness. And when we're copying our creature's spells, we essentially get, 4 times the initial creature's toughness? So yeah, this can really pad our life total a ton. And then there's Moldgraph Monstrosity, which can be incredibly impactful in a different way. It's an 8/8 insect with trample for 4 green, so yeah, just getting 2 copies of this can already have a huge impact on the game for some big hits. But on top of that, when it dies, we exile it, then we return 2 creature cards at random from our graveyard to the battlefield. So on top of getting these 2 giant insects with trample, when they do die, we get a huge benefit as well. Again, with enough creatures in our graveyard, when they die, we're essentially getting, 4 creatures back in total for, again, 7 mana plus having them as 8/8s originally, so yeah, that's a lot of value. But now that we've talked about cards that can help us with our situation, let's talk about some ways to throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. So first up, let's talk about Reclamation Sage, a 2/1 elf shaman that when it enters the battlefield, we can destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Again, I really had to pick and choose which elves would be in this deck because again, elf is a pretty popular creature type. But Reclamation Sage is absolutely fantastic. I mean, doubling up on that ETB and getting 2 artifacts or enchantments, that's pretty huge. And speaking of that, there's Acidic Slime, which is a 2/2 death-touching ooze, and when it enters the battlefield, we destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. So not only do we get 2 death touchers, but we get even more options on what to destroy. And speaking of options, there's Brutalizer Exarch, a 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, we choose 1. We search our library for a creature card, reveal it, then shuffle our library and put that card on top of it, or we put target non-creature permanent on the bottom of its owner's library. Now, you kinda gotta be careful with this because you don't want to take that first one twice, because obviously if you get a card on top and you can't draw it right away, well then you're just gonna shuffle your library again and get a different card. But this can either be a creature tutor plus some removal, or just 2 times removal. But next up, let's talk about some more Evoke creatures like that Muldrifter that I talked about earlier. Evoke is a very fantastic thing with this commander. Foundation Breaker is a 2/2 elemental that costs 1 and a green, and when it enters the battlefield, we can destroy target artifact or enchantment. So again, though we just get to keep 1 of these in play if we evoked it, we basically are getting a 2/2, and we get to destroy 2 artifacts or enchantments. And then Aether Snipe is a 4/4 elemental with an evoke cost of 1 blue, and when it enters the battlefield, we bounce target non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. And again, getting to bounce 2 things and getting a 4/4 into play is pretty nice. And with this, keep in mind that bouncing our own things might be the right call as well. Our commander is very good at using and abusing ETBs, so if we need an ETB specifically, we can, just bounce that one back to our hand and use it again. And of course, we've got some removal as well that comes from mutate creatures with things like Gemrazor and Sawtusk Demolisher. Gemrazor has, whenever this creature mutates, destroy target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. So yeah, again, even just on the initial mutate, for just 3 mana, we get to destroy 3 things. Speaking of which, Sawtusk Demolisher says, when this creature mutates, destroy target non-creature permanent, its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. So yeah, this can deal with a lot of things. But now let's talk about some other ETBs that can help us out as well with Mana War, Phyrexian Ingester, and Thorn Mammoth. Mana War says when it enters the battlefield, return target creature to its owner's hand. And again, keep in mind that it might be a good idea to actually bounce our own creature, but you've got options. One thing that we're not going to target our own creature with most of the time though is Phyrexian Ingester. It's got imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-token creature. It gets +X+Y, where X the exiled creature card's power and Y is its toughness. So not only can this get rid of big threats, but it can also become a big threat. And speaking of getting rid of threats, there's Thorn Mammoth. It says whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Thorn Mammoth fights up to one target creature you don't control. So again, with this and its copy in play, now when any creature comes into play, if we want Thorn Mammoth to fight, it can fight. Or what I mean is, I guess, each of them can fight. So yeah, we can just demolish opponents' boards by getting rid of creatures, left and right. And speaking of getting rid of our opponents' boards, with this deck, we're also going to be running some pretty flexible spells like Perplexing Test, Aether Gale, and Brawl's Expertise. Perplexing Test says, choose one, return all creature tokens to the owner's hands, or return all non-token creatures to the owner's hands. In a way, this can actually be a game-ending spell for us if we're set up correctly. Again, our commander is going to help us make a lot of tokens, whereas our opponents might not have any tokens. So essentially, before our turn at instant speed, we can just wipe everyone's board. You know, our creatures are going to get bounced back to our hand, which is okay, but our tokens are going to stay in play. So now we've got an army of tokens that can help us demolish our opponents, and yeah, by recasting our creatures, we're going to get even more value. And then Aether Gale can also help us by picking and choosing. It says return 6 target non-land permanents to the owner's hands. So again, if we want to bounce our own creatures for value, we can, but yeah, this is a very flexible spell that can help us out in a lot of situations. And finally, Brawl's Expertise says return up to 3 target artifacts and or creatures to the owner's hands, and you may cast a card with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So this can provide us with a ton of value, bouncing 3 things, whether that be artifacts and or creatures, but we also just get to cast something else from our hand for free. And again, if that's a creature that can get copied with our commander, we're getting an absurd amount of value from this one spell. But in order to get all this value, it's going to be very important for us to actually protect our commander. So let's talk about some ways to protect Volo with things like Giant's Amulet, Mask of Avacyn, and Dawnglade Regent. Giant's Amulet is an equipment that costs a blue and it has equip 2, and it says equipped creature gets +0/+1 and has this creature as hexproof as long as it's untapped. So this is a cheap equipment that we can get down early, and by getting it on Volo, yeah, it's going to protect Volo because we're not really going to be utilizing our commander to attack too often or at all. Next up, there's Mask of Avacyn that says equipped creature gets +1/+2 and has hexproof. Again, I'm not going to complain about getting the +1/+2, but the main thing here is that hexproof. Speaking of which, Dawnglade Regent is fantastic for that. It's an 8/8 elk, and when it enters the battlefield, we become the monarch, and as long as we're the monarch, permanents we control have hexproof. So essentially, with everything having hexproof, this can protect a lot of things, including the Dawnglade Regent, so our opponents are probably going to have to actually swing at us or cast a wrath to get through. And yeah, being the monarch can be pretty nice if we're set up properly for some extra card advantage as well. Of course, we also have some counter spells that can help us out too with things like Negate, Neutralize, and Saw It Coming. Negate says counter target non-creature spell, Neutralize can counter any spell, and we can also cycle it for 2, and then Saw It Coming also can counter any spell, and it's got Foretell for 1 and a blue. So yeah, each of these can be helpful in a lot of situations, and again, when it comes to protecting our commander, counter spells are a very good thing. But speaking of good things for our commander, let's now talk about some clones and how they can help us out with things like, well, Clone, and Mirror Image, and Vizier of Many Faces. Clone is a 0/0 shapeshifter, and it can enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. Now, as long as we don't have a shapeshifter in our graveyard, these clones can just basically copy and be whatever they want and get us 2 copies of that. When we cast the clone, it's seen as a shapeshifter from our commander, so if we don't have a shapeshifter in play or in our graveyard, it gets a copy. Then when those clones do come into play, they become copies of whatever's on the field that we want to copy. So in a way, it's kind of like getting around a creature type, because then they just become that same creature type as whatever they copied. So if we've got something with a very powerful ETB that's already in play, well, now we can just get 2 copies of that ETB and 2 copies of the creature. Just make sure you're careful with this though, because again, if a clone is in your graveyard, it's going to count toward that shapeshifter, which is kind of shutting down all those other clones. So because of that, we're still only running a certain amount of clones, though again, they do have a lot of utility in this deck. And we actually do have ways to control our graveyard, but we'll get to that here in a bit. Regardless, Mirror Image is basically just a slightly cheaper cheaper version of clone that can only copy our own creatures, but again, for this deck's purposes, that's fantastic. And then Vizier Many Faces is incredible in this deck. It can enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except if it was embalmed. The token has no mana cost, it's white, and it's a zombie in addition to other types. So by embalming this, we can just basically get it out of our graveyard and yeah, not count toward that shapeshifter, or I guess cleric as well. And then Wallstone Identity can enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it's a wall to its other types and has defender. When we do, we tap the copy creature and it doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Wallstone Identity. So yes, with this we do have to be somewhat careful on what we want to clone because we are going to be tapping it down if it's one of our own, so yeah, just keep that in mind. Still, if the ETB is good enough from that creature, yeah, it's probably going to be worth it, or we can just copy an opponent's creature and shut that one down. And then Mercurial Pretender is kind of like a repeatable clone. It's got pay 2 blue, return this creature to its owner's hand. And then Vesuvian Shapeshifter is kind of like a morph clone that can shift what it is. As it enters the battlefield or is turned face up, we can choose another creature on the battlefield. If we do, until Vesuvian Shapeshifter is turned face down, it becomes a copy of that creature, except it has at the beginning of your upkeep, you may turn this creature face down. So we can shift it and change it for whatever our needs are. Now, earlier I did mention that there are cards that can help us, well, take care of our graveyard to make sure that we can still double up on certain effects like these. So let's talk about some of the cards that can help us prune our graveyard with things like Scab Ruinator, Scavenging Ooze, and Selesnya Uologist. Scab Ruinator is a 5/6 zombie horror, and as initial cost to cast it, we exile 3 creature cards from our graveyard. On top of that, it's got flying, and we can also cast it from our graveyard too. So first off, yeah, 2 5/6 flyers for just 3 mana, that's pretty fantastic. But secondly, yeah, this can help us get rid of creatures in our graveyard that would otherwise hamper our other creatures from getting copied. If we've got an elf in our graveyard, but we also have one in our hand, we're going to want to get rid of the one in our graveyard so we can double up on that one in our hand. Another way to do that is with Scavenging Ooze. It's a 2/2 Ooze that has pay a green, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1 counter on Scavenging Ooze and you gain 1 life. So this can actually help us hose our opponent's graveyards as well and can really help us prune our own. And one that can be even more impactful in this deck is Selesnya Uologist. It's a 3/3 Centaur Druid that says pay 2 and a green, exile target creature card from a graveyard, then populate. So this can get rid of creatures in not only our graveyard, but our opponent's graveyards, and when we do, we populate, and yeah, there's going to be a ton of tokens with this commander. So we can further use and abuse ETBs of tokens, and yeah, have a lot of fun with this card. Another one that can help us out in multiple ways, though, is Loaming Shaman. It's a 3/2 Centaur Shaman, and when it enters the battlefield, target player shuffles any number of target cards from their graveyard into their library. So obviously this can be a huge setback against any kind of a graveyard or reanimation strategy. But also it can help us pick and choose which cards in our own graveyard that we want to essentially get rid of. Well, not really get rid of, we get them back into our library, but you know what I mean. But now that we've talked about all these cards that can help us out, deal with our opponent's stuff, how do we actually finish out the game? First off, we can go really wide and make an absurd amount of creatures with this deck with things like Spore Mount, Rampaging Baloths, and Trumpeting Gnar. Spore Mount is a 3/3 fungus that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green sapling creature token. So again, when we get this in play and we copy it, because yeah, fungus is not a very popular creature type, so we're going to get 2 copies. Now when any land comes into play under our control, we get 2 1/1s. Taking that up a step further, though, there's Rampaging Baloths, a 6/6 beast with trample with landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. So by getting 2 of these in play, whenever we get 1 land into play, we are getting 2 4/4 beasts. So 1 land for 8 power, yeah, that's pretty incredible. And again, we can really use and abuse this effect with certain creatures, again, that have ETBs like Springbloom Druid that get us lands into play, so yeah, things get out of control really quickly. Speaking of getting out of control, there's Trumpeting Gnar, which is a 3/3 that says, whenever this creature mutates, create a 3/3 green beast creature token. So again, right away, we're getting 3 of those tokens, and again, if we keep mutating onto that creature, we get even more. Or, you know, we can just get a ton of tokens right away all at once with things like Mirror Battlesphere and Hornet Queen. Mirror Battlesphere is going to give us 4 1/1 Mirror when it comes into play. And then whenever it attacks, we can tap X untap Mirror we control, and if we do, Mirror Battlesphere gets +X/+0 until end of turn and deals X damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking. So yeah, with this and the other Battlesphere that came into play, and all the tokens that came into play, we can essentially tap, 9 Mirror and just ping someone for 9? And then Hornet Queen might be a little more straightforward, but incredibly deadly. It's a 2/2 insect with flying and death touch, and when it enters the battlefield, we get 4 1/1 green insect creature tokens with flying and death touch. So in total, thanks to the copy, we are getting a total of 10 flying death touch creatures. So good luck to our opponents getting past our defenses and surviving the onslaught of insects. And of course, we can make our creatures even deadlier with things like Great Oak Guardian and Enraged Forerunners. Great Oak Guardian is a 4/5 tree folk with flash and reach, and when it enters the battlefield, creatures target player controls get +2/+2 until end of turn, untap them. So yeah, getting 2 copies of this means that we're getting twice the effect, so yeah, +4/+4 out of nowhere to all of our creatures, and we're untapping them. Obviously, this can help us out as a nice combat trick if we're swinging with a bunch of creatures, or it can help us as a different kind of combat trick if our opponents are attacking us and we just, untap our creatures and block big. But when it comes to swinging for a lot, of course, Enraged Forerunners can help us with that, a 7/7 boar with Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. When it enters the battlefield, other creatures we control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. So yeah, an absurd amount of power coming from this and the token, pumping our entire team +4/+4 and giving them Vigilance and Trample. But an even bigger pump actually comes from the golden pig of this deck, which is the #1 card out of our 99. And the golden pig of this deck is Blossoming Bog Beast. It's a 3/3 beast, and whenever it attacks you, gain 2 life, then creatures you control gain Trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X the amount of life you gain this turn. So we get 2 of these in play, and then we attack with both. We gain 2 life with one, giving our creatures +2/+2. Then we gain 2 life with the other, and then the amount of life that we've gained in this turn is 4, and our creatures get +4/+4. So yeah, at the very least, by swinging with 2 of these, that's going to be +6/+6 to all of our creatures and Trample. Good luck to our opponents when we do that. And especially good luck to them if we've got Verdant Sun's Avatar in play as well for some extra life gain. Yeah, things can get really out of hand. But now that we've gone through all the non-land cards in this deck, let's quickly go through the lands for it as well. First up, 2 cards that I want to highlight that can work really well in this deck are cards like Tangled Florahedron and Endless Sands. Tangled Florahedron obviously can be a lane with a backside that comes into play taps for a green, but otherwise it's a 1/1 elemental that can tap for a green. So if we need it as a land, great, but if not, we can just cast this and basically, get 2 mana dorks, so that's pretty nice. And then Endless Sands helps us out in a very different way. It can tap for our colors, so we can pay 2 and tap to exile target creature we control. On top of that, we can pay 4 and tap to sacrifice it and return each creature card exile with it to the battlefield under their owner's control. So the first way that this can help us out actually might be somewhat counterintuitive. Let's say that we've got a creature in play that has a specific creature type that we, don't want in play anymore because we've got a creature in our hand that's going to be really good if we can copy it. So we can just, exile that creature. We do lose the creature, but we're going to be getting an extra copy of the other creature, and again, with the powerful ETBs, we can really take advantage of that. And then at some point, we can just, pay 4, tap, and sacrifice this, and get all those creatures that we exiled back. So again, with any of those creatures that do have ETBs that we exiled and we're getting back, we're getting those ETBs as well. So yeah, this simple and pretty cheap land can be really effective in a deck like this. Of course, some other lands I'm going to go through really quick that can be effective are lands like Command Tower and Exotic Orchard, which can pretty much tap for any color we need. And then some simple fetch lands like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse of course can help us as well, and Ash Barrens, which has basic cycling for 1. We've also got some lands that can ramp us with things like Mirrored Landscape and Blighted Woodland. Mirrored Landscape getting us 2 basic lands that share a land type, and Blighted Woodland getting us whatever 2 we want. And then we've got some lands that come into play tapped and can tap for either our colors with Quandrix Campus and Tanglepool Bridge. On top of that, with the Campus, we can pay 4 and tap to scry 1, and Tanglepool Bridge is indestructible. And of course, there's Thornwood Falls, Simic Guildgate, and Woodland Stream that each come into play tapped and tap for either our colors, and Thornwood Falls even gains us a life. And finally, let's round things out with 22 basic lands, 13 of those being a forest, and 9 being an island. Now, when it comes to the price of this deck, again, every single card was under $1 except Volo, which is, around $2.30, so that's not too much. But as you can see, the estimated overall price for this deck is just $27.57. Now, also, I don't believe that Scryfall actually even breaks out basic lands from that price, and I think the basic lands are 10 cents a piece, which you can see in the bottom right where it says 13 forests for $1.30, so it's even less if you take those out too. Regardless, do keep in mind though that these prices are based on TCG player pricing, and they're not based off of heavily played or damaged cards, so it could be even lower than this too. But also, this doesn't include shipping, so it's just the cost of the cards in total, so do keep that in mind as well. Regardless, at the end of the day, it's still a very budget-friendly deck. But as I'm wrapping this episode up, I would love to hear your feedback on, pretty much everything about this episode. I always try to read through as many comments as I can, and I'm always taking feedback and trying to make adjustments to make my videos better. So obviously you can see small adjustments between this episode and some of my previous deck techs. Based on some more feedback from some more recent episodes, the pricing is back in the episode where I include the price on every single card. Just keep in mind that if you're watching this episode, a couple of weeks or even a couple of months in the future, those prices might have adjusted, and some might have adjusted quite a bit. Also in this episode, I did go through every single card in the deck, yes, including the lands as well, so yeah, the episode length is going to be a little bit longer than previous ones, so I'd love to get your feedback on that too. And then when it comes to displaying the price like I just did, I think the most effective way to do this is actually just on Scryfall like I did. If you're building a deck or a list on Scryfall, it's really easy just to see your estimated cost in the left side. So this is yet another adjustment that I made in the episode because of some feedback on basically how shipping rates can be different in different countries. Regardless, I'm always looking to improve my episodes and to make them more enjoyable for you. So yeah, any and all constructive criticism and feedback is appreciated. So thank you in advance for your feedback, and of course, as always, thanks again and have a good one.